Conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand, and there it is. I've subtitled, as you can see, An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. Tonight's session is number 19 in the series, and we're going to continue our study of the 1984 election. Last week we discussed the fact that, rather the conclusion, it's not a fact, that I believe that Walter Mondale, the Democratic presidential candidate, intentionally threw the election. He did two very strange things, one of which we discussed last week, and we're going to start with the second point in a few seconds. I believe the first thing that Walter Mondale did that indicated that he wanted to lose the election intentionally was he promised a tax increase. You might remember at the night of the Democratic convention when he got the nomination, his acceptance speech told us very clearly that he wanted to give us a tax increase. I believe that when he said that, millions of voters in America promised not to vote for Walter Mondale. The first lesson you learn in politics is never, never, never promise a tax increase, yet Walter Mondale did. Was it bad advice? Who knows? I believe it was because he wanted to lose the election. Let me cover the second major mistake he made, and then we'll get into the continuation of the 1984 discussion of the 1984 election. I believe the truth that Mondale wanted to lose the election is graphically illustrated in this cartoon that appeared in the November 5th, 1984 U.S. News and World Report. It shows Walter Mondale all alone on board his, quote, "I'll raise your taxes bandwagon," unquote, and he's shown saying into his megaphone, "Come one, come all, jump on, folks. Hey, everybody, yoo-hoo, hello, testing." In other words, the way not to appeal to American voters is to promise a tax increase. Yet that is precisely what Walter Mondale did. He broke the cardinal rule of politics on national television in front of the largest audience he would have at any one time. Now, the second major mistake that I believe that Mondale made was appointing Geraldine Ferraro as his vice president. Appointing a woman to be vice president was indeed a first, but it didn't help him in the election. First of all, it is fairly concluded that Mondale's appointment of a woman did not appreciably gain him any feminine votes. He already had the support of the feminists, including the endorsement of the National Organization for Women. U.S. News and World Report said this, number 8, even before naming Ferraro, Mondale started out with powerful feminist support, including the endorsement of the National Organization for Women. If Mondale had not nominated Mrs. Ferraro, where would these feminists go? Do you think they'd vote for Ronald Reagan? Not very likely. Those who wanted him to appoint a woman just because she was a woman already were supporting him. The only thing that makes sense is that Mondale knew, it would help him throw the election because he knew that decision would cost him votes. And that is precisely what happened. This article was published a short time after the 1984 election. The headline reads, "Woman Hurt Demo Ticket, 50% surveyed say." The article says, number 9, half the Americans in a Media General Associated Press survey said it hurt the Democrats to have a woman on the ticket in last month's presidential election. Only 18% of those polled said that Mondale's selection of a woman helped him in the campaign. The final results of the election bear this out. Ronald Reagan carried every state in the 1984 election except Mondale's home state of Minnesota. Mondale's defeat ranks as one of the worst defeats in recent history. But if I am right, why did Mondale want to throw the election? I believe it was to give Ronald Reagan a mandate to increase the national debt. Ronald Reagan's two administrations have given this nation trillions of dollars of debt, far more than any other president in the history of this nation. To me, it is the only thing that makes sense. If in the past few weeks, we've looked at a series of organizations in America actively working towards a common goal. We're going to now briefly discuss what that goal is. What do these organizations want in America? We can answer that question by recalling the words of H. Rowan Gaither, the president of the Ford Foundation. We read his comment during our discussion of the foundations in America, so we're going to repeat that now. This is what Rowan Gaither said, number 10. We shall use our grant-making power so to alter our life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. But the planners face a very difficult problem. How are they going to succeed if the American people do not want to be merged with the Soviet Union? They know that the American people would not tolerate it if the planners announced a merger one day and accomplished it the next. Now this is Norman Thomas, and he told us how they are hoping to succeed. Norman Thomas was a socialist, as you might recall. We've discussed him in the past. And that he ran for the presidency on the Socialist Party ticket from 1928 to 1948. Mr. Thomas told us how this nation would first go socialist and then merge with the Soviet Union. This is what Mr. Thomas said, number 11. The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism. Notice, we're not going to get socialism, we're going to get liberalism, but they're the same thing. Under the name of liberalism, they, the American people, will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened. But how do you get the American people to accept liberalism when it is truly socialism? By having the American people elect anti-socialist, anti-communist conservatives who are not anti-socialist, anti-communist, or conservatives. On April 17, 1958, Norman Thomas said this, number 12. The United States is making greater strides towards socialism under Eisenhower than under Roosevelt. Uh-oh. That's interesting. More socialism under Eisenhower than under Roosevelt. The conservative Barry Goldwater said he could have run on the 1932 Democratic Party platform run on by candidate Franklin Roosevelt. Yet President Franklin Roosevelt repudiated the platform he ran on and gave America a giant bite of socialism. Mr. Thomas said that President Dwight Eisenhower was even more liberal than Franklin Roosevelt. The American people have been voting conservative and have been getting liberal, and the socialists are aware of the game. They've figured it out. Now we've seen the goal, we've seen the strategy to achieve that goal, and we've seen some of the organizations involved in taking us to that goal. Now I'd like to show you how this conspiracy has used war to achieve their goals. I'd like to briefly cover this book. I've got to find it here again. The Report from Iron Mountain. I held it up in the last hour. It's here someplace. Well, anyway, I can't find it. The Report from Iron Mountain. It's called The Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. Notice that the book discusses whether peace is desirable. It is the position of this book that wars are used to control people. The book asks the question of how those who create wars for control purposes will control people if the world disarms. We will discuss that aspect of this book, how to control people in times of peace, a little later in this series. But now I'd like to discuss what this book teaches us about the purpose, the true purpose of war. There is some disagreement as to who wrote the book called The Report from Iron Mountain. The book says that it was the product of a commission of 15 members created by Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and Dean Rusk, all three members of President John Kennedy's administration. It is interesting that all three of these gentlemen were members of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. That book says that all 15 commission members agreed unanimously on the contents of the book, and that they agreed that the book should not be published. But someone got a book publisher to publish it in 1966. The book caused a minor national scandal because the book says that wars are beneficial. They serve useful functions. As I said, they are created to control people. George Orwell set the tone for the report when he wrote some similar comments in his book entitled 1984. There's George Orwell's little paperback, 1984, written in the year 1948. Mr. Orwell wrote that book 18 years before the report from Iron Mountain was written, and this is what he wrote about war and what the purpose was. Number one, the object of war is not to make or prevent conquest of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact. The Iron Mountain Report says that the public believes that the purpose of war is, number two, to defend a nation from military attack. According to the report, this view is a myth. Wars are not fought to protect a nation from foreign aggressors. They have far more important and significant reasons, as we're going to see. There are, according to the report, two broad functions of war. What they call, in the terms of the report, the invisible and the visible functions of war. The Iron Mountain Report says this about the invisible functions of war, number three. War has provided society with a system for stabilizing and controlling national economies. No alternate method of control has yet been tested in a complex modern economy that has shown it is remotely comparable in scope or effectiveness. So wars are fought for hidden reasons, for controlling people and economies. And they are so effective that those who plan wars cannot find anything comparable. The report continues, number four. War fills certain functions essential to the stability of society. Until other ways of filling them are developed, the war system must be maintained and improved in effectiveness. Not only does war control the people, so does the threat of war. The report said this, number five. The possibility of war provides the sense of external necessity without which no government can remain in power. The historical record reveals one instance after another where the failure of a regime to maintain the credibility of a war threat led to its dissolution. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to show you how the American government has constructed its own enemy, communism, in Russia. Our government has created Russian communism. We'll cover that thoroughly in a couple of weeks. One of the reviewers of the book 1984 said this, number six. Orwell shows the economic significance of continuous arms production without which the economic system cannot function. Furthermore, he gives an impressive picture of how a society must develop which is constantly preparing for war, constantly afraid of being attacked, and preparing to find the means of complete annihilation of its opponents. Notice, to keep your national government, you must create your own war threat. But we in America would never tolerate that, would we? We in America are too informed. We have a free press to tell us the truth, don't we? If the American government ever assisted its own enemy in building a war machine for that enemy, our free press would tell us, wouldn't they? Now let's examine the question. Has America ever constructed its enemy's war machine? Yes, it has. It built the war machine for Nazi Germany in World War II. It built Russia's war machine and has been doing that for over 70 years. We're going to discuss these facts in the next few weeks to prove those statements. But let me give you a few examples of the research that has been done to show you that America has been in the full-time business of building its own enemy. And as we go through these examples, let me ask you, if you have never heard this before, why you have never heard this before. Don't forget that America has a free press that would expose the folly of this policy. But I believe you already know this because America's free press has told you. So I'm going to repeat what you already know. As I said, Americans built Nazi Germany's war machine prior to and during World War II. An excellent book on this subject is this one, entitled simply Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony C. Sutton, and there it is. Here is the incredible story of the American financiers who provided the material and money Hitler used to launch World War II. Professor Sutton wrote this book, and on the back of the book it says, quote, "It makes every previous book on World War II obsolete," unquote, and it does, because we have not been told that our own government permitted American capitalists to build the war machine to kill Americans. But you already know that, don't you? Because America has a free press to tell you. As I said, America has constructed the Russian war machine, and this construction job has been continued for over 70 years. A couple of excellent books on this subject are these two. Let me give you one here first, simply called East Minus West. I'll hold the book sideways so you can see the cover. East Minus West Equals Zero by Werner Keller. This book was written by a German by the name of Werner Keller, as you can see. And this book makes the point that the West, primarily the United States, has built the Soviet Union's military power. But you already know that because America has a free press, and they've told you, haven't they? Another book on this subject is this one, called National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union, by, once again, Anthony C. Sutton. Dr. Sutton documents the fact that 90 to 95% of Russia's military power has come from the West, particularly the United States. We have built our own enemy. Another vital transfer of technology from the United States to the Soviet Union was the transfer of the atomic bomb to the communist government of Russia in 1943 and 44. The first one to tell us of this transfer was Major George Racy Jordan, the officer in charge of expediting Lend-Lease to Russia during World War II. Major Jordan wrote this little paperback entitled From Major Jordan's Diaries. And there it is, the cover. In this book, Major Jordan details how he physically saw the transfer of the plans and the material for the atomic bomb to Russia through Great Falls, Montana during World War II. This man was there, he saw it, and in his book he documents the case of how our government gave Russia the atomic bomb in the middle of World War II. Major Jordan's book was confirmed in 1983 when James Roosevelt, one of the participants in the transfer, wrote this book entitled A Family Matter, a novel by James Roosevelt. And there's the cover. There you can see the photograph of President Roosevelt sitting beside, there's Joseph Stalin, and there's Winston Churchill, and the book is entitled A Family Matter. In this book, Mr. Roosevelt, the son of President Roosevelt, tells the reader how his father asked him to give the atomic bomb to Russia in 1943 and 44 during World War II. Those two books corroborate each other. One supports the other. our government gave the atomic bomb to Russia during World War II. But once again, you know all about this, don't you? Because you've been hearing it for years from America's free press. Yes, America has been in the enemy building business for over 70 years for the same reason, and for the same reasons rather, as detailed in the report from Iron Mountain. Those who plan wars to control people, according to the report, haven't determined as yet, number 7, what the optimum levels for armament production for purposes of economic control are. We don't know yet how much of a military budget that the government needs to control its people. When President Carter was in the military, in the government, he decreased the military budget. President Reagan increased it. These planners are still experimenting. How much money must we spend to control the American people? The planners, according to the report, have not yet determined have not yet been able to determine, number 8, what the minimum levels of population destruction are necessary to maintain the war threat credibility. In other words, how many people do we need to kill in limited wars to keep the war threat alive? The planners also haven't determined yet, number 9, the optimum cyclical frequency of shooting wars. How many wars should we have and how often to control the people? The planners cannot figure that out. What are the functions of war once the planners plan one? The report from Iron Mountain tells us that there are several. Number 10, war provides anti-social elements with an acceptable role in the social structure. The younger and more dangerous of these hostile social groupings have been kept under control by the selective service system. Let's have wars to give young anti-social elements something to do. What a great idea. Let's keep them busy. The report continues, number 11. As a control device, the draft can again be defended. The level of the draft calls tend to follow the major fluctuations in the unemployment rate. When the employment rates go up, more people are unemployed, of young people especially. When that goes up, we've got to draft them, give them something to do. But you need a war to do that. So you have to plan a war. But don't misunderstand. They're doing it because they want to give the young people a job. Isn't that a great idea? War also serves an ecological function. Number 12, man destroys surplus members of his own species by organized warfare. If there are too many people consuming the nation's scarce natural resources, have a war so that there are less young people to consume those resources. The report says that war benefits science. Number 13, war is the principal motivational force for the development of science. We should have wars every so often so that we can develop better scientific skills. That's what the report says. But the most important purpose of the war hasn't been discussed yet. The report says that war is a, number 14, a general social release for the dissipation of general boredom. When America gets bored by too many soap operas on their evening television, it is time to plan another war. If you haven't read the report from Iron Mountain, you should. And you should at least read that book and my book, The Unseen Hand, and I think that that'll help you understand what the purpose of war is. Others have figured it out as well. Taylor Caldwell, the author of many novels on this conspiracy, said this in her book entitled Ceremony of the Innocent, number 15. There will be no peace in the tormented world, only a programmed and systematic series of calamities, wars and calamities, until the plotters have gained their objective. An exhausted world willing to submit to a planned Marxist economy and total and meek enslavement in the name of peace. We will get so sick and tired of these continuous wars that we will beg our government to give us peace, even if it means we must live under communism. Taylor Caldwell figured it out. Are there any other examples of Iron Mountain's thinking? In 1952, Congress created the Select Committee to investigate foundations. Norman Dodd was named the director of research for that committee, and he visited one of America's tax-free foundations, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He said he read the minutes of their meetings and then concluded, number 16, the trustees of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace brought up a single question. If it is desirable to alter the life of an entire people, in other words, if it's desirable to alter the life of the entire people, meaning if it's desirable to bring about a new world order, are there any means more efficient than war? They discussed this question for a year, and then they came up with an answer. There are no known means more efficient than war. War can be used to change the life of an entire people. If you want a new world order, plan a war. Mr. Dodd continued, number 17. That leads them to a question. How do we involve the United States in a war? This was in 1909. Mr. Dodd says that the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, notice the name, the Endowment for Peace, wanted a war. In 1909, there were several who wanted America in a war because they wanted to alter the American lifestyle. And in 1914, the world was fighting World War I. George Orwell said this in his book that we just held up a few minutes ago, 1984, number 18. The First World War was the beginning of that development which tended in a relatively short time to destroy a 2,000-year-old Western tradition of hope and to transform it into a mood of despair. George Orwell agreed that one of the purposes of World War I was to destroy a 2,000-year-old Western tradition. That tradition, that 2,000-year-old Western tradition, is called the Old World Order. Notice that Mr. Orwell said that World War I was a beginning. The job has not been completed yet. There was more to follow. Mr. Orwell continued, number 19. He said the Second World War, in which all the fighting nations lost some of the moral considerations which had still existed in the First World War. The planners had not succeeded in World War I, so they planned World War II. Let's return now to the report from Iron Mountain and try to determine who wrote that incredible report, number 20. There is considerable evidence that the report is the work of the Hudson Institute and Herman Kahn. There is an Iron Mountain just a stone's throw, literally, from the Hudson Institute near Croton-on-Hudson. Croton-on-Hudson is a city north of New York City, I believe. And I want to introduce you now to Herman Kahn, if you've never heard of him. Herman Kahn. In December of 1968, Life magazine did a series on this gentleman, and there it is. I put it in the folder. I Xeroxed it. And there's a picture of Mr. Kahn on the left there. And here is the article. I photocopied and put it in the folder. I made this about 2 or 3 years ago, I guess, and because I believe that more people should know more about Herman Kahn. The article told us some very interesting things about this gentleman, Herman Kahn. He described himself as being number 21, one of the 10 most famous obscure Americans. And then Life told us why he thought he was so famous, number 22. Mr. Kahn decided in 1961 to help determine the entire future of the United States, and time permitting, much of the world beyond. According to Life magazine, Mr. Kahn wants to plan our entire future. The article continued, number 23. This is a process of invisible power. At its extreme, this influence can commit a nation to social programs and military actions which have neither been fully explained nor publicly debated. One day, as that power pervades and grows more sophisticated, it may so affect the course of government that any nation's policies may be locked in as if by automatic pilot years before the men who are elected to govern ever take office. According to Life magazine, people like Mr. Kahn can set the course of government for many years in advance. Who elected Herman Kahn to anything? He's never been elected to any elected position, never. Life quoted Mr. Kahn, and we can get a slight idea of what he believes in, number 24. I wish more or less that all progress could stop now. In a generation, we'll be into microbiology and population control. That's why I like the New Left. They're trying to stop all this ideology. I like the hippies. I've had LSD a couple of times. In some way, I'd like to join. No matter what his ideas are, Mr. Kahn's ideas are apparently acceptable to the United States government. Life says that Mr. Kahn's Hudson Institute received $1.36 million of income in 1967 from the Office of Civil Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and from other U.S. governmental sources. A couple of years ago, I called Mr. Kahn on a talk show and asked him if he or his Hudson Institute had ever written the report from Iron Mountain. And I want to be fair, because he denied on that radio program that he or the Hudson Institute had anything to do with the writing of that report. And I cannot respond to that response. I don't know whether he's telling the truth or not. But I will say this. Someone did write that report, and whoever did had figured out how the game is being played. I urge you to read the book, The Report from Iron Mountain. Now that we know that some people think that wars are not fought to defend national borders, let's now look at World Wars I and II. Let's start with the first of those, World War I. Those who write the Accidental School of History have told us that the war started on June the 28th, 1914, when an 18-year-old student shot the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg Austrian throne. I'd like to do two things now. I'd like to see if we can determine the real reason for the war, and secondly, I'd like to see if there was any similarity between World Wars I and II. Up until the First World War, America's foreign policy had been to stay out of foreign intrigue. George Washington, our first president, laid down that policy in his farewell address made as he was leaving his second term of office on September the 17th, 1796. This is what George Washington said, number 25. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, or caprice? In other words, Washington said, stay out of Europe's problems. That had been our foreign policy for about 140 years. But there were others who wanted America involved in a European war. Let's take a look and see how America's foreign policy was changed from that given to us by George Washington. I'd like to start our study of World War I by examining two very important appointments. The first appointment was made on October the 25th, 1911, when Winston Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in England. This made Mr. Churchill the head of England's Navy. This was an odd choice because Winston Churchill later became aware of this conspiracy, or a conspiracy rather, in the Russian Revolution and publicly talked about it. Here's what he said about 9 years later. Number 26. Winston Churchill wrote, "From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt." Now here Churchill traces the origin of the Russian Communist Revolution of 1917 back to the Illuminati. In other words, back to 1776. By the way, Spartacus was the name, the secret name, that Adam Weishaupt took to conceal his identity inside the Illuminati. For Mr. Churchill to know that concealed fact shows that he had really made a study of the conspiratorial Illuminati. Let's return now to Churchill's quote, "From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx." And here Mr. Churchill links Karl Marx back to the Illuminati, something that I did as well in this series a couple of weeks ago. "To those of Trotsky." Here Mr. Churchill connects Leon Trotsky, the communist Russian revolutionary of 1917, to Marx in 1848 and back to Weishaupt in 1776. In other words, Mr. Churchill was admitting that there was an ongoing conspiracy involved in the world's affairs for over 140 years. Winston Churchill could have written my book entitled The Unseen Hand. Now let's continue once again with Mr. Churchill's quote. "This worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization," notice, the overthrow of civilization, "has been steadily growing." Notice that Churchill says that this conspiracy wanted to overthrow civilization. If you overthrow the civilization, you must replace it with a new civilization. That new civilization is called the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the New World Order. Churchill, by the way, a member of the Masons, had figured it out. He admitted that there was a conspiracy and that its purpose was to create a new civilization. Let's finish with Mr. Churchill's quote. "Now, this band of extraordinary personalities from Europe and America," notice that Churchill admitted that this conspiracy was also in America, "have gripped the Russian people." Mr. Churchill admitted publicly that there was a conspiracy, and that this conspiracy had actually been in existence for over 100 years, and that this conspiracy had been responsible for the Russian Communist Revolution. Quite a mouthful from one so high and powerful. But the interesting thing, as we are going to see, is that after he made the startling revelation, after he said those things, Churchill actually worked for the conspiracy. We'll examine that in more detail in the next few weeks. And the second major appointment was made on March the 17th, 1913, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the United States. Mr. Roosevelt was also aware that there was a conspiracy. Franklin Roosevelt wrote this, number 3. Mr. Roosevelt had written to his close friend and political mentor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, number 27. "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson. President Roosevelt said that a hidden banking conspiracy had owned the United States government for over 100 years. Now, why does he know, or what does he know about this conspiracy that we don't know about it? He knows that something was going on, and he admitted that in a letter to Colonel House. By the way, it is claimed by Daniel Delano, a relative of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt were 8th cousins once removed. They were both related. One more connection must be pointed out as well. Both Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were members of the Masonic Order. World War I started on August the 4th, 1914, as I said, when England entered the war against Germany. Almost immediately, pressure in America started to get the United States into the war on the side of England. One of those who wanted America to intervene in the war was Franklin Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during that time. The author Joseph Lash, in this book, entitled Roosevelt and Churchill, 1939 to 1941, says this about Roosevelt's enthusiasm for the war. Number 28. More than once, towards the end of 1916, after the election of Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt would come into Josephus Daniels' office. By the way, Josephus Daniels was his boss, the Secretary of the Navy. And Roosevelt would exclaim, "We've got to get into that war." The president at that time was Woodrow Wilson, and he was publicly stating that America would stay out of Europe's problems. In other words, we were not going to become involved in World War I. The American people had remembered President Washington's advice: stay out of European affairs. Woodrow Wilson said this in 1916, number 29. No people ever went to war with another people. Governments have gone to war with one another. Peoples, as far as I can remember, have not. And this is a government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war. But unknown to the American people, their government was conspiring behind their back with the English government to create an incident that would inflame the American people to demand our entry into World War I. The two governments planned on intentionally sinking the English passenger liner, the Lusitania, with American passengers aboard. Because Woodrow Wilson's advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, had pledged American intervention in the war in March of 1916. This agreement was approved by Woodrow Wilson. In other words, President Woodrow Wilson was lying to the American people when he promised us he would keep America out of World War I. In other words, he knew we were going to get involved, and he promised us we were not. To understand how that could happen, it becomes important to study the Lusitania itself. In 1902, Cunard Lines, the owner of the Lusitania, and the English government signed an agreement whereby England would finance the building of two large steamers, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. And in exchange for that concession, Cunard agreed to turn the two ships over to the English Admiralty in the event of war involving the English government. As I said, the war started on August the 4th, 1914, and the Lusitania was turned over to the English government in September of 1914. She was equipped by the English government with 12 6-inch guns and sent back out into the waters. The Lusitania ended up in New York and was scheduled to depart on May the 1st, 1915. While it was in the harbor, while the Lusitania was in New York, it was loaded with 6 million rounds of ammunition being shipped to England by to England and France, by J.P. Morgan. You might remember that it was the two Morgans, J.P. and his father Junius, who made a fortune during the Civil War running the blockade into the South. Now J.P. Morgan was selling ammunition to England during World War I, but he's having it loaded onto a ship that many people believe is a passenger ship. The strategy was to sink the Lusitania with Americans aboard so that the majority of Americans would indignantly demand our entry into the war against Germany. But it was important that it was important for no one to know that the Lusitania was loaded with 6 million rounds of ammunition, so that there would be American civilians aboard the ship. William Jennings Bryan President Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of State, knew about the ammunition on board the Lusitania and promised he would persuade the President to publicly warn Americans not to travel. Number 30, no such warning was issued by the President, but there can be no doubt that President Wilson was told of the character of the cargo destined for the Lusitania. Wilson did nothing. President Woodrow Wilson, 31, took the position that Americans were within their rights to travel on belligerent ships during the war, and that the government was in honor bound to uphold the rights of its citizens. The German government actually placed advertisements in New York newspapers telling the American people it was unsafe to travel on ships flying the English flag. This is one such advertisement. It reads thusly, number 32. Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. You can't say it any clearer than that. Yet our government wanted Americans on board the Lusitania, and board her they did. Here's the strategy. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, asked Colonel Edward Mandell House, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" Colonel House replied, number 33, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war." So the Lusitania sailed for Liverpool on May the 1st, 1915, with hundreds of American tourists aboard. Before she sailed, the captain was told that an escort ship, the British cruiser called the Juno, would meet her and escort her into Liverpool. Shortly after noon on May the 5th, 1915, 2 days before she was sunk, the Admiralty ordered the Juno to abandon her escort mission and return to Queenstown. No one knows who gave that order, but it had to be either Winston Churchill or the Admiral of the fleet, Lord Fisher. Only those two people had the authority to order that ship back. The Lusitania was now on its own. Now, the interesting thing to know is that the British Admiralty knew that there were German submarines in the waters near Ireland in the path of the Lusitania. By December of 1914, British naval intelligence was intercepting almost every German signal, and a staff of experts was analyzing those signals. By the end of January 1915, the British were able to advise the Admiralty of the departure of every U-boat, every submarine, as it left for patrol. The Admiralty knew specifically that the German submarine, the U-20, was in the path of the Lusitania. No warning was sent to the ocean liner. The U-2 fired one torpedo into the Lusitania, and 18 minutes later, she completely disappeared into the water. 1,098 people were lost, including more than 128 Americans. The Admiralty ordered a formal inquiry, and one was conducted in June and July of 1915. On July the 17th, 1950, the Court of Inquiry reported that the ship sunk because it was struck by a torpedo. No mention was made about the 6 million rounds of ammunition exploding. Not one of the passengers who referred to an explosion elsewhere on the ship appeared at the inquiry. This mighty liner was sunk by one torpedo. That's what we've been told. That was an interesting conclusion because one of the Lusitania's sister ships had been hit with 12 torpedoes, 12, and it didn't sink. So the official story became the fraudulent story. One torpedo sank the Lusitania, not J.P. Morgan's 6 million rounds of ammunition. The records of the inquiry were sealed for 50 years. Don't forget, the people have a right to know as long as you live 50 years after the inquiry. When the records were finally opened, the author of this book, entitled The Lusitania, Colin Simpson, studied those records and went on to write this book, and there it is. It says it's a shocking second-by-second account of the single most important event in the outbreak of World War I. And he says in that book, he called this, number 34, the foulest act of willful murder ever committed on the high seas. But the hoped-for cry for war against Germany from the American people failed to materialize. So the plotters changed their strategy. We're going to get into the war, and the Lusitania didn't work. What else can we do? How else can we get America involved? Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State, who replaced William Jennings Bryan, who resigned over the Lusitania affair, put the new strategy, thusly number 35. We must educate the public gradually, draw it along to the point where it will be willing to go into the war. And draw us along slowly they did. But they had to wait until President Wilson was reelected. Wilson won the 1916 election in November of that year. He was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1917, and Congress declared war on April the 6th, 1917. The war didn't last very long. It ended on November the 11th, 1918. What was the cost of the planned and designed World War I? Number 36. Almost 13 million men in the various armed forces of the participants died in that war. What did the war cost the United States? Number 37. Life magazine said that the monetary cost was $22 billion. That war cost us $22 billion. One who gave a slightly higher estimate was Smedley Butler, a general in the Army at the time. He said the war cost us, number 38, $52 billion. And it yielded over $16 billion in profits to those who made a profit on the war. What was the purpose of the planners? One who answered that question was historian Walter Millis, who wrote this, number 39. Colonel House's sole justification for preparing such a batch of blood was his hope of establishing, and notice this phrase, a new world order of peace and security. After the war ended, the nations involved signed the Treaty of Versailles on May the 7th, 1919. Some at that meeting realized that the terms imposed on Germany by the treaty would create conditions that would force Germany to strike out again. One of the representatives from England was Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary at the time. And here's what he said about the Treaty of Versailles, number 40. He said, "This is no peace. This is only a truce for 20 years. Isn't that something? No peace, a truce for 20 years. Notice what he said. It was his opinion that there would be another war 20 years after the treaty. 20 years after the Treaty of 1919 is 1939. World War II started in 1939. Did Lord Curzon know something that no one else knew? He figured it out. Colonel Hermann Kniebel, I presume, K-N-I-E-B-E-L, was a member of the German Armistice Commission at the signing of the treaty. When he left, he said this, number 41, au revoir in 20 years. In other words, we Germans will see you people again in 20 years. 1919 plus 20 is 1939. The war started in 1939. Did Colonel Niebuhr know something that no one else knew? Now, why did these two individuals think that the treaty would cause a second world war? What did the Treaty of Versailles require of Germany? As we discussed some time ago in this series, Germany had to pay war reparations to the victors, reparations worth more than the entire worth of the whole nation. Perhaps you'll remember that Germany paid those reparations with the printing press. They printed billions upon billions of paper marks. This hyperinflation destroyed the middle class and nearly bankrupted the nation. A leader stepped forward to criticize the treaty, and his name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler blamed the resulting depression on the Treaty of Versailles. He used that depression to come to power. Now the inevitable question must be asked. Hyperinflation, as we've discussed over and over again in the past, is intended to cause a depression. Adolf Hitler used that depression to come to power. Now, is it possible that those who wrote the treaty wanted to cause a depression because they knew that Hitler would use that depression to come to power? I want it understood that I believe it is exactly what was planned by the planners. One of the purposes of World War I was to create the conditions that a madman like Hitler would use to come to power. We'll cover how this conspiracy used Adolf Hitler for their purposes a little later in this series. The second major purpose of World War I was to involve as many nations as possible in the World War so that the planners could blame the war on national governments. And then the planners could offer the predetermined solution, a world government. A world government that would abolish national borders, and without national borders, they reasoned there would be no wars. Without nations, they say, because nations cause wars, there will be no wars. So the world government was offered to the people of the world to end wars. Remember that World War I was called, number 42, the war to end all wars. Now, how could that be accomplished? By abolishing national borders. They wanted us to believe that nations cause wars and that all we had to do was end war. All we had to do to end war was to abolish national borders. That, of course, was a lie. Nations do not cause wars. Governments do not cause wars. People cause wars. That world government they wanted was the League of Nations, number 43, the world government of the future created at the end of the war. Woodrow Wilson signed the charter for the United States and brought it back to the Senate for ratification. Apparently, the Senate remembered the foreign policy advice of George Washington about staying out of foreign entanglements. The Senate vote for accepting the League of Nations was number 44, 38 in favor of the League, 53 against signing the treaty. 58% of the senators voted against the treaty. Wilson was completely dismayed. He had made 40 addresses and traveled 8,000 miles to get the treaty ratified, and now it had been defeated by the Senate. We'll pick that up next week, and we'll continue our discussion of World War I and the League of Nations. And I invite you to tune us in again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm the host for this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand, and there it is. I subtitled the book, An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. That book came out in 1985. Tonight's session is number 20 in our series, and we're going to continue our study of World War I. Last week we discussed why I believe it was started and what the purpose of it was. We also discussed how Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, signed the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, and how the League of Nations Treaty was also signed by him. The Senate, as we discussed last week, refused to ratify the treaty, and Woodrow Wilson was very concerned as to that event. Tonight we're going to see why Woodrow Wilson wanted that treaty signed, the League of Nations Treaty. Why did he work so hard after the treaty was refused by the Senate? Why did he go on a speaking tour of the United States, and why did he care about getting that thing created? I believe the reason that Woodrow Wilson had worked so hard for the treaty was simply because Woodrow Wilson had been promised the presidency of the world government that would come out of the League of Nations after the war was over. President Woodrow Wilson was to become Emperor Woodrow Wilson. Someone else who felt this way was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who said that Wilson, number 45, saw himself as a future president of the world. Others supported the League of Nations as well. One was an organization known as the Grand Orient Lodge of Freemasonry. This was the Masonic lodge that had created the French Revolution of 1789 that we've discussed in this series. Now that group has been quoted as writing this, number 46. It is the duty of universal Freemasonry to give its full support to the League of Nations. So the Masons wanted the League of Nations to be chartered and to be created. So the war to end all wars was fought to create, I believe, a world government. But war making can be extremely profitable. As long as our goal of creating a world government is worthwhile, we might as well make a little profit at the same time. Now this is a book entitled America's 60 Families. I don't know if you can read that or not. I'll open the thing up and we'll get you the front page. But this book was written about 30 or 40 years ago, I believe. There it is, America's 60 Families by Ferdinand Lundberg. This book talks about the America's wealthiest families. And in that book, he makes an interesting observation about profit making in World War I. He wrote this, number 47. Ferdinand Lundberg said, "The war provided an unparalleled opportunity for the richest families to make large profits at the expense of the public. They took care that the victory was as expensive to the common taxpayer. They uttered no cries for government economy so long as the public treasury was at their disposal." Another book that talked about profit making during World War I was this one, written by William Hoffman. It's simply titled David, and it's about David Rockefeller. And the author said that the Rockefeller family made a modest profit from the war, meaning World War I. Here's what David Hoffman said about the Rockefeller family, number 48. "The Rockefellers made far more than $200 million from that conflict." That's a rather tidy profit from a war, isn't it? Wars can be very profitable. The only ones who lose from a war are the ones who fight it, and also those who must pay for it. The next major event in our study of the early years of the 20th century was the election of 1920. One of the major issues in that campaign was whether the new president should urge the Senate to reconsider their decision and ratify the League of Nations Treaty. The Democratic candidate for president in 1920 was number 1, James E. Cox, and the vice presidential candidate was a future president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Number 2, the Republican candidate was Warren G. Harding. Mr. Harding had made his views on the subject of the League quite clear to the American people. He had said this, number 3, "It will avail nothing to discuss in detail the League covenant, which was conceived for world super-government." Mr. Harding had understood that the League of Nations was intended to create, as he calls it, a world super-government. In the existing League of Nations, world government with its superpowers, this republic will have no part. I think it is quite clear that Mr. Harding was opposed to the League of Nations Treaty. Mr. Harding had figured it out. Harding was a supporter of number 4, President William Howard Taft, the president who was defeated because he was opposed to the Private Reserve Bill signed by his successor, Woodrow Wilson. We talked about that several weeks ago. William Howard Taft was opposed to the Federal Reserve. I call it the Private Reserve Bill, and because of that, he was defeated. After Mr. Harding was elected, he became President Harding, and after Taft was elected, during his time rather as being elected, President Harding was named, I've got this all wrong. After he was elected, President Harding named Taft's campaign manager, Harry Doherty, as his Attorney General. Harry Doherty became President Harding's he was his campaign manager and became his Attorney General. The American people overwhelmingly denounced the Democrats and Woodrow Wilson for almost getting America into the League of Nations by electing Warren Harding as president. Number 5, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson was elected by a margin of only 52% to 48% over the Republican candidate, Charles Evan Hughes. Remember that Mr. Wilson's major issue in that campaign was his claim to having, quote, kept us out of the war, meaning World War I, unquote. So there was more reason to vote for Wilson than there was for Hughes. In other words, the man kept us out of war. Number 6, in 1920, Warren G. Harding, because he opposed the world government hidden inside the League of Nations Treaty, was overwhelmingly elected by a margin of 64% to 36% for the Democratic ticket of Cox and Roosevelt. That election margin was the greatest margin ever attained by a winner in any election from 1864 to 1964. In other words, the American people were voting their convictions. They were telling Mr. Harding, as president, stay out of the League of Nations. They remembered the advice of President George Washington in 1796 to avoid foreign entanglements. But the fact that Harding had been so overwhelmingly elected did not escape the eye of this conspiracy. The second thing that caught their eye was the fact that Harding's Attorney General, Harry Doherty, was actually prosecuting criminals. Number 7. In the 3 years preceding the Harding administration, 100,913 criminal cases were prosecuted. In the 3 years of the Harding administration, from 1921 to 24, 168,606 criminal cases were prosecuted. That's a 67% increase in activity. Included in that number of prosecutions, and this is the key, were a number of convictions against America's wealthiest businessmen under the Sherman antitrust law. That really got their attention. President Warren G. Harding and his administration had to go. President Harding, for a reason I have not been able to determine, surrounded himself with men from the oil industry, and it was these men who would ultimately bring Mr. Harding down. Harding selected Charles Evan Hughes as his Secretary of State, and Mr. Hughes was an attorney for Standard Oil. His Secretary of the Treasury was Andrew Mellon, owner of Gulf Oil. His Postmaster General was Will Hayes, an attorney for Sinclair Oil, and his Secretary of the Interior was Albert Fall, who has been described as a, quote, protege of the oil men. In other words, Mr. Harding surrounded himself with oil men. The incident that would bring Harding down involved 3 large tracts of oil lands that belonged to the nation and were set aside as naval oil reserves. The idea was that the oil could be kept in the ground for the use of the Navy at some future time when it might not be possible to obtain this fuel from commercial producers. Within a short time, Sinclair oil stocks had increased more than $50 million in value, and a wonderful killing was made by the insiders who had held them for their certain rise in value. The reason the stock went up was because in April of 1922, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, leased one of those oil reserves, called the Teapot Dome Reserve, to Sinclair Oil. This was done secretly and without public bids from other oil producers. Of course, that caused Sinclair Oil stock prices to go up by more than $50 million. In October of 1923, an investigation was begun on the Teapot Dome leases. Mr. Fall and Harry F. Sinclair were indicted for fraud and conspiracy. Mr. Fall was convicted, fined $100,000, and sent to prison for a year. But Mr. Sinclair was acquitted. Isn't that interesting? Another Senate committee was appointed to investigate Harry Doherty's involvement, but he too was acquitted for lack of evidence. So they tried to get his Attorney General, Doherty, involved in the Sinclair oil mess, and he was freed. He was not guilty. In all the material I've heard of on the oil scandal, I have never read one writer who ever even alleged that President Harding was ever involved in the improper leases. But it was his appointment Mr. Fall, who made the lease, so it was Harding who had to pay. But President Harding's ordeal was not over. He started a trip to the West, and when he got to Seattle, Washington, he contracted ptomaine poisoning, possibly from the banquet he attended. He died a short time later. There are many who believe that the president was poisoned because of the 300 people at the banquet. He was the only one who got ptomaine poisoning. Isn't that interesting? So Warren G. Harding was no longer president. One way or another, either by being poisoned, possibly, at a banquet, or by the Teapot Dome scandal, the conspiracy had to remove him from office. He dared to oppose their plans for a world government, and he had to be removed from office, and he was. Now I'd like to shift the subject to the Second World War of 1939 to 1945. World War I was fought to give the world a one-world government. That goal was not reached because the American people would not let the Senate ratify the treaty for the League of Nations. So the conspiracy sat down, I believe, and planned World War II. I'd like to discuss how the United States was duped into that war. In other words, World War I and II are very similar in their goals and in the methods utilized to draw us into each of those wars. And in several cases, it was the same people involved in both wars. But to understand the Second World War, one must understand the role of a significant secret society known as the Thule Society. For those not old enough to remember the Second World War, I'd like to introduce you to some of the principal characters in that drama. World War I was fought between two major adversaries. One entity was called, number one, the Axis powers, and consisted primarily of the governments of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The other adversary in World War II was called the Allied powers, number two, the Allied powers. This entity consisted primarily of England, France, China, Russia, and the United States. Germany was the main power, the main force behind the Axis powers, and the head of the government was Adolf Hitler. He was the leader of the Nazi Party. The word Nazi, by the way, was short for the party's real name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So here we can see that the Nazi Party was a socialist party by their own admission. Adolf Hitler clearly understood the game plan, as he is quoted as saying this, number 3, National Socialism, meaning the Nazi Party, will use its own revolution for the establishing of a, guess what, a new world order. So Mr. Hitler understood. He correctly realized that to establish a new world order, he'd have to destroy the old world order, and that's what his goal was. Hitler said this, number 4, yes, we are barbarians. It is we who will rejuvenate the world. The present world is near its end. Our only task, is to sack it, he said. You must destroy the old world order to create a new world order. Yes, indeed, Adolf Hitler understood. Another writer also saw a possible connection between the Freemasons and the Nazi Party. He wrote this, number 5. One can rediscover the important role played by German Freemasonry as a model for esoteric. And the word esoteric means a secret meaning not to be understood by most people. So he's saying here that the Nazi Party was modeled after the esoteric meaning of the Freemasons. The quote continues with the structuring of the Nazi Party. To understand the Nazi Party and Hitler's leadership of it, one must understand its predecessor, a secret society that we've already just briefly alluded to, called the Thule Society. Now this is a book written about the Third Reich, Hitler's government. It's simply called The Occult and the Third Reich. And there we see the swastika, we're going to discuss that in a minute, and wrapped around it are several snakes. This book discusses the Thule Society and its occult beginnings. The author writes this, number 6, it is in the Thule Society that one has to look for the real inspiration of Nazism. The book goes on to identify the source of the power of this society. The author writes this, number 7, in the Nazi cosmology, the sun. Notice this, the sun is the key to the Thule Society. In the Nazi cosmology, the sun played a prime role as a sacred symbol of the Aryans. Please hold this thought that the sun was a, quote, sacred symbol, unquote, of the Nazi Party. We'll see how that fits with the nature of Hitler and the organization behind him. It was the Thule Society that indoctrinated Hitler about an imaginary problem, the Jewish people. The book says this, number 8. Hitler saw in the Jewish people, with their black hair and swarthy complexion, the dark side of the human species, while the blonde and blue-eyed Aryans constituted the light side of humanity. Hitler undertook to extirpate, meaning eliminate, from the material world its impure elements to lead it back to glory. Hitler wrote about his hatred of the Jews in his book entitled Mein Kampf, and it isn't as if no one could have known beforehand that he had a terrible solution in mind for the Jewish people. His book sold over 250,000 copies before he came to power, and over 1 million copies in his first year as Chancellor. Another book about the Thule Society is this one called, this is a rather beat-up copy, it's my personal library copy, called The Spear of Destiny. We'll discuss the main subject of this book a little later. And this is what this book says about the Thule Society, number 9. The inner core within the Thule Society were all Satanists who practiced black magic. The committee and the 40 original members of the Nazi Party were all drawn from the Thule Society, the most powerful occult society in Germany. The Thule Society has got to be understood to understand World War II. Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, also belonged to the Thule Society. By the way, Rudolf Hess just died a few months ago. This book is entitled The Murder of Rudolf Hess. and it lays out the evidence that the Rudolf Hess who died in Spandau prison just a few months ago was not the real Rudolf Hess. The one who died in Spandau prison was, I believe, a double. And the author discusses why the double agreed to spend 40 years of his life in a prison. We're being lied to, once again, about the real identity of Rudolf Hess. The Thule Society, number 10, included amongst its members judges, police chiefs, barristers, lawyers, university professors, and lecturers, aristocratic families, leading industrialists, as well as a host of rich and influential bourgeoisie. Notice that the Thule Society was not a working man's organization, but a meeting place for the wealthy and near powerful. You'll remember that this is just like the membership of the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt that we've discussed so often in the past. The authors of the two books that we've just mentioned on the Thule Society have identified Adolf Hitler as a sun worshiper and a Satan worshiper. I don't believe you can understand World War II without knowing this simple fact. The authors say this, number 11, there is hard evidence showing that Hitler was possessed. Hitler was possessed. The solar cult transmitted to the Cathars by the Manichaeans, taken up by the illuminated ones, I believe he's referring, this author, to the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt, was to crop up finally in the form of the swastika of the Third Reich of Hitler's Nazi party. Now this is a swastika, and it's universally recognized as a religious symbol representing the sun. This is called the leftward rotating swastika and represents goodness. When you flip this swastika over, you get the right rotating swastika, which universally represents evil. The right rotating swastika was used as the symbol of the Nazi party. The swastika was the symbol of the Nazi party. It was personally selected by Adolf Hitler, even though it is known that he knew the difference between the two symbols. In other words, Hitler selected the right rotating swastika because he knew it represented evil. Hitler wanted a symbol representing the evil nature of man. But the symbol has a far more interesting meaning. The symbol of the Nazi party is a symbol of the sun, and the sun is a symbol of Satan, the devil. Now this is a book. I'll hold it sideways because there's no printing on the stop. In fact, I'll turn it even this way. There it is. It's called simply The Two Babylons, and it was written by Alexander Hislop. He writes about the sun as a symbol for something else, number 12. Along with the sun and identified with him was the serpent worshipped. In the mythology of the primitive world, says Owen, the serpent is universally the symbol of the sun. In Egypt, one of the commonest symbols of the sun or sun god is a disk with a serpent around it. As the sun was the great enlightener of the physical world, so the serpent was held to be the great enlightener of the spiritual, by giving mankind the knowledge of good and evil. The worship of the serpent began side by side with the worship of the sun. What is the serpent a symbol of? The serpent is a symbol of Lucifer, also called Satan, the devil. The swastika was a symbol of the sun. The sun is a symbol of the serpent, and the serpent is a symbol of Lucifer, the devil. It all fits together. Adolf Hitler was a sun worshiper. He chose a sun symbol for his Nazi party, and he knew that the sun was a symbol of Lucifer. I'd like to discuss a little more of the evidence that Hitler was a Satan worshiper. The mentor of the Thule Society that Hitler joined was Dietrich Eckart, and here's a picture of him. Eckart was a, quote, dedicated Satanist, unquote, and claimed to his fellow members in the Thule Society, number 13, that he had personally received a kind of satanic annunciation that he was destined to prepare the vessel of the Antichrist, the man inspired by Lucifer to conquer the world and lead the Aryan race to glory. Dietrich Eckart was extremely important to Adolf Hitler. Number 14. Adolf Hitler considered Eckart as the most important single influence on his life. It is known that Eckart experimented with numerous drugs, and he taught Hitler to use them as well. Adolf Hitler, number 15, attained higher levels of consciousness by means of drugs. And when Mr. Eckart lay dying in 1923, he told the world about Hitler's involvement in the occult. Eckart said this, number 16, "Follow Hitler. He will dance, but it is I who have called the tune. I have initiated him into the secret doctrine, opened his centers in vision, and given him the means to communicate with the powers. Do not mourn for me. I shall have influenced history more than any other German." Man cannot make a truer statement. Eckart influenced history more than any other human. The next evidence that I would like to offer about Hitler's interest in the occult is his interest in a relic from the past called the Spear of Destiny. It is claimed that this is the sword that pierced the side of Jesus Christ at the crucifixion. It has been preserved in Vienna, Austria, and Hitler learned about its location. He visited the Habsburg treasure house in Vienna in 1909 and heard the guide describe the spear thusly. Number 17. There is a legend associated